And at the early service afterwards, somebody said, well, why didn't you say he was your husband? And I didn't want to be sexist. But this is to make up for all of the times that he's given me sermon ideas when I have not taken them. Now it's his turn.
Good morning. Many of those who visit our church are struck by the large blue stained glass window on the north wall. But few know very much about it, so I thought this was a fitting occasion to try to find some information to share with you. I had a lot of help from Angela Finney, who's our church historian, and she helped dig out a lot of records, and I'm very grateful for that. This window reflects not only the end of the Great War, it ties squarely to that, which was 100 years ago this morning, as we've already spoken about, but it ties to two other serious and terrible events that impacted those who worshiped in this church 100 years ago. Let me start with the Great War. It's hard to overstate how bad that was for humanity. In America, we had 53,000 service members recorded as dying in combat. That was out of about 4.7 million who served in uniform. Back then, our country only had 103 million people, less than a third of what we have today. So those 4.7 million in uniform represented something in the range of 5% of our population. The numbers of American dead and injured were far less than the comparable numbers around the world. Civilian and military deaths on all sides are today roughly estimated at 17 million people, and another 21 million people were wounded. Beyond that, the war casualties were a part of, but not a reflection of everything that happened to civilians. There was a large-scale genocide waged against the civilian population in Armenia. There was displacement by the war of millions of refugees, heavily, of course, in France and Belgium, but also in Serbia and Greece and Italy and Iran and other places. Summing it up, on All Saints' Day in November 1914, roughly 4 months after the war began, a war that was to last for another 4 years, the Pope was quoted as saying, "This war is the suicide of the world." Part of what humanity suffered was the fundamental change in warfare itself. In earlier times, battles lasted a day or 2 days or a week. In World War I, they lasted months. The Battle of the Somme lasted 4.5 months. Verdun was the longest continuous battle in world history, over 10 months in 1916. In that one battle, 500,000 British, French, and German soldiers were either killed or wounded. Another long battle in 1917, shortly before Americans arrived in force at the end of the war when we got in, was called Ypres or Passchendaele. That lasted 4 months. Battles on that scale left us with only rough estimates of the deaths or casualties, but we know they were huge. They vary in numbers because massive battles fought by tens of thousands of troops precluded identification and with much accuracy of individual casualties, and the overall record keeping, of course, was very difficult in the midst of something like that. Following the war, France and Britain and the United States all put up Tomb of the Unknown Soldier monuments, which today still exist. This morning in Paris, world leaders went to the Arc de Triomphe, where the French monument is. If you go to Westminster Abbey and the floor, and the only grave in this entire abbey that you're not supposed to walk over is their Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And of course, Arlington Cemetery here in our country has such a monument. The reason we lost track of so many human beings was the new weapons that were employed were in an unprecedented, violent, and impersonal manner of waging war. Heavy modern artillery, airplanes, tanks, machine guns, submarines, barbed wire, landmines, flamethrowers, and worst of all, poison gas. The war gave us widespread use of canned food, wristwatches, daylight savings time, and what we still call trench coats. Those were the benign developments during the war. But in the end, the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire in Austria-Hungary were gone. Germany threw out its emperor. The Russian Revolution swept Bolshevik communists into power. And many new countries were formed out of territory taken from old countries, and those still persist in territorial fighting today. As to this church, our records indicate 170 men and 11 women served in uniform. 3 of those 181 people were lost. 1 died in combat toward the end of the war, 2 from illness while in the service. Those losses were out of roughly 6,500 Ohio troops who did not survive war service. It's an interesting sidelight that 2 of the ministers of this church, or 2 people who had ties with this church, served as service personnel during the war. Dr. Thomas H. Campbell, who until 1918 is recorded as having been the senior minister in this church, served as director of religious education at an army camp in Kansas late in the war. The war news would have been a daily concern for those who sat in our pews and worshiped here. To be sure, they had letters home from service members, they had newspaper reports, and they had, to some extent, motion pictures even, communicating the experience to Americans. Nearby in Chillicothe was Camp Sherman, the 3rd largest training camp in the country. Civilians heard about the war at Liberty War Bond drives. They grew victory gardens. They had meatless or wheatless days in their kitchens as the nation tried to conserve food to feed American troops, and more importantly, sometimes to send and try and feed Europe. The federal government even encouraged ministers to preach about the need for food conservation, and civilians heard about the war in other ways too. If you'd gone up the street to a Buckeye football game in 1918, the front page of the football program would have had drawings of a football player and an American soldier in full uniform carrying a weapon. And across the bottom of the football program on the front page was the caption, "Buy Liberty bonds, buy twice as many." So it was impossible for the civilian population to get any distance from that terrible war. They had to also deal with anti-German propaganda, which was widespread even here in Ohio. German names were Americanized. New Berlin, Ohio became North Canton. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. There are even published stories, I saw several of them in different resources, about German dog breeds actually being killed in Columbus out of this fervor over the war. German Lutheran churches, German Catholic churches were coerced into stopping services in German language, and schools and colleges stopped teaching German. On the other hand, a Methodist bishop wrote during 1918 in the church's official weekly newspaper, which was called the Northwestern Christian Advocate, as follows: "The gospel of hate is not a necessary spur to make Americans fight. It can be done without resorting to the debasing tactics of Germany itself." Aside from the 54,000 combat losses and 204,000 wounded that we had in the American service forces, a related statistic is important too and sometimes overlooked, namely the non-combat deaths. Those exceeded the combat deaths in the American forces. 63,000 American service members suffered non-combat deaths, of which more than half, historians tell us, resulted from the 1918-1919 flu epidemic. It was called the Spanish flu at the time because it was first widely reported in Spanish newspapers. They were one of the few countries that was not in the war, so they had no censorship, and so they could talk about this epidemic as it spread through both military forces and civilian populations. Historians think that the epidemic may have begun in America at Camp Funston, an Army camp out in Kansas. Troops customarily lived close together in naval and army installations, and that no doubt allowed the illness to spread quickly. But the flu pandemic, as it became known later, was the first pandemic since the Black Plague in the 1300s, and it hit right on top of the World War. The flu came in waves, which varied in intensity, but worldwide, records show something like 30 million people died from the flu, over and above war casualties, or including some. At least one of the fatalities here at King Avenue appears to have died from the flu, even though it was service-connected because he was in the service, and I'll talk about him in a minute. It affected the population deeply for years afterwards. My mother was 10 years old in 1918, and she spoke for the rest of her life periodically about her favorite aunt who had died from the flu, who was only 25. One of the features that was horrible about the flu was that it struck hardest at those in their 20s and 30s. Scientists since then think that perhaps it was because the antibodies in young people are stronger and they fought back quicker, and it sort of overpowered the human system, and that you killed yourself with the toxins released from your own antibodies at that young age. But so many of the 30 million we lost were in the prime of youth, on top of the soldiers and service people that we lost at the same time. The third catastrophe that coalesced and that met that period in 1918, 100 years ago, was the church fire. Records suggest that in August 1918, a workman was up repairing the roof and released sparks from a torch of some sort. The building was only 14 years old. It burned to the ground in 2 hours. So it was against the backdrop of the war, the flu pandemic, and the church fire that those who sat here 100 years ago gave us this magnificent window. The window was dedicated in 1922 after the church had been rebuilt. In the program rededicating the window is the following statement. This is a, quote, gift of many parents in memory of the young men and women who served in the Great World War, unquote. The window, as you can see, uses heraldry, essentially a modern version of art from the Middle Ages, reflecting the Gothic revival in architecture that became popular in the post-World War I period. It was built, if I didn't mention that, by a Columbus company. Unfortunately, they went out of business in the 30s, late in the Depression. The words in the window are somewhat hard to read, but they include the following individual words: fidelity, mercy, victory, peace, piety, and service. Most of the figures are female and understood to be angels. Two are the Archangel Michael and the Archangel Gabriel. Above Michael is the phrase, quote, "They loved not their lives unto the death." Below that is the statement, "To honor the devotion of all those from this congregation who served in the Great War." Above Gabriel, the words are, quote, "On earth, peace, goodwill toward men." And lower down, the words, to commemorate the sacrifice of those who in that service laid down their lives. The window includes spires and crowns, usually topped by a small cross, and shields. The colors of the shields along the bottom of the window, including the one in the middle, which is understood to represent the United States, are in the colors of particular countries allied with America in the war. Several figures in the window are shown holding a sword, but you'll note that none of them have it in a position of attack. Another figure holding but not wearing a knight's armored helmet is on the far right of the window. I think in balance, our window is a memorial to peace. It clearly does mention the word victory, but it reflects very little about warfare. Unlike most war memorials, it contains no direct reference to any battle, and depicts no marching troops, airplanes, ships, or other modern devices of war. Rather, gratitude for the peace seems to dominate this space. In closing, let me share with you some information about the 3 fatalities with close ties to King Avenue. For Frederick and Ada Jurgis, this north window no doubt offered a weekly opportunity to sit and remember again one of their sons who was lost in combat. Corporal Lawrence Jurgis, known to his friends as Red, was born in 1893. He grew up at 323 West 9th Avenue. He was one of 10 from Columbus North High School lost in the war. He went on to graduate in 1915 from Ohio State, where he was editor of the Macchio Yearbook and on the staff of the Lantern. Following graduation, he moved to Connecticut, and it was from there that he entered the service in August 1917 in the 101st Machine Gun Battalion of the 26th Division. The 26th Division is particularly remembered in New England. It was heavily from Massachusetts and the New England states. Corporal Jurgis fought at various places in France, but then lost his life late in the war on October 24th, 1918, to wounds from artillery shelling the day before. Corporal Jurgis is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in France, along with over 14,000 other soldiers who were killed in that last big battle that Americans fought in shortly before the war ended. It's not known from our records whether the Jurgis family ever visited his grave, but for most Americans, travel to France was impossible at the time. So I assume that every Sunday this large memorial was a very meaningful embrace for the Jurgis family here in the church. A little sidelight about the Jurgis family. They had another son who was in the same war. He was a naval officer, a junior officer in the Navy. Prior to entering service, Howard Jurgis had been the starting quarterback for the Buckeyes from 1915 to 1917. And in 2 of those teams, he won the conference championship in the Big Ten. His own son, Howard Jurgis Jr., no doubt had a tie to this church too, and he's remembered for playing quarterback for Ohio State before entering officer training in World War II. That officer training took him to the University of Michigan, and there he quarterbacked 3 Michigan football teams, including their 1947 championship team. Howard Jurgis Jr. is the only person ever to quarterback both the Buckeyes and the team up north. King Avenue also lost in the Great World War 27-year-old First Lieutenant Hurst V. Campbell. He was in the Quartermaster Corps. He never made it to France. He was serving in Baltimore, Maryland in October 1918 when he reportedly died of pneumonia. Lieutenant Campbell was originally from Napoleon, Ohio, and was commissioned as an officer in August 1917 at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana. His family lived at 1405 Neal Avenue at the time of his death. The last service member we lost was Private Henry M. Waddell. He was born in Gallipolis and was part of the U.S. Army Cavalry at the Columbus Barracks from April 1918 until his death in June 1919 from what was termed nephritis, or kidney inflammation disease. Private Waddell was only 20 years old. His last address, as shown in Army records, was 35 West 11th Avenue. As you sit in church this morning and in days to come, I hope this background allows you to reflect on the significance of the north window. I think it teaches us a great deal about the faith and stewardship of those who dealt with and conquered the terrible adversities of 1918. Thank you.